This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. G'day and welcome to Basket Case Clubs. Today's episode is a little different and is a recording from an online workshop that we ran on Thursday the 21st of August. It was part of our series of free online workshops that we run here at CPR Group, and the topic was unlocking club funding. Always a really popular topic. People are often keen to tap in to hear about the ways that they can make their lives really easy and get lots of money for nothing and not doing any hard work and so on. And I dispel all of those myths in this particular recording. So we are capitalizing on the recording from this session to share as a podcast episode. Lots of really valuable content in here, and I address some frequently asked questions that we often get posed to us in the context of grant funding. So have a listen, enjoy, and I hope you can gain some real benefit from the tips and tricks that I share through this session. We're going to take a little bit of a different approach today, and we're going to follow an FAQ format. So there's still going to be some slides, and there'll be the questions that we typically get asked about writing competitive grant applications, but I'm going to take more of a conversational and FAQ approach, and I think that we've been taking that approach with some of our other training sessions recently, and it works really well in terms of contextualizing the content that I'm talking through based on the very real questions that you may well be facing in your organisation. So as always, it's important, I think, to start discussions in this way. I want to briefly share with you some of my story of connection to people, place and culture. I was lucky enough to grow up very close to here on the Sunshine Coast. Our head office is in Maroochydore, and I grew up in a small community tucked in amongst the cane fields of Bli, and my house literally was separated from the Maroochy River only by a grass backyard. So as a kid, any chance I got, my friends and I would be out on the water in our boats, we'd be fishing, water skiing, we'd head up the river on a Friday afternoon and come back on a Sunday. Our parents trusting us implicitly from when we were about 12 or 13 years of age. And given that I almost never wore shoes, I was quite literally very well connected to country. So the first inhabitants of this Maroochy district were the Cubby Cubby people. And for thousands of years, they have hunted in the surrounding ranges, fished the local rivers, and gathered seafood from our wonderful ocean off Mooloolaba here. The place names Maroochy and Maroochydore are derived from the Yagara words Murukachi, meaning red bill black swan, and Murukachida, meaning the place of the black swan. So I acknowledge, of course, importantly, the long-standing connection of the Cubby Cubby people to the land on which I grew up, and I'm joining from Cubby Cubby country today. So I offer my deepest respect to Cubby Cubby elders past and present, and also to emerging leaders. I also acknowledge the people, place and spirit of the lands from which all of you joining online come from and join from today, and also those who might be watching or listening to this recording. And finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all of you for your contribution to the sport community, recreation industry across Australia. Without you, your communities would be nothing like what they are today. So thank you for the hard effort, the significant effort and sustained work that you put in as a volunteer in many of your cases to serve your communities and the people within them. Let's talk grants. So, like I say, we're taking an FAQ approach here, and these are questions that we get quite a lot. And I want to just tackle, in some cases, some myths, and in other cases, some of the really important matters that come up in our engagements directly with organisations. So firstly, and this one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's quite practical as well. And sometimes I get asked, Steve, what is the single best piece of advice you can offer for winning more grants? And my answer is probably not what you expect. Sometimes when I'm in a room of people, I will put this question to them and they'll say things like, read the guidelines, make sure you're answering the questions that are actually asked, make sure your organisation is eligible, make sure your project is eligible, and all of these answers are great. However, they're not the answer that I'm looking for. The answer that I'm looking for, and the answer that I give when people say, tell me what's your single best piece of advice for winning more grants, is I say, forget about grants. And I'll try and articulate what I mean by that answer. And you're probably thinking, hold on, why is he talking about that? I'm here to listen to him talk about winning more grants. Why is he saying forget about more grants? And I'll try and articulate it in a story. I was running a leaseholder forum for a large council in southeast Queensland. Pardon me. And there was about 170 people in the room. And one of the topics of the evening's session was grant writing. And there were sporting groups, there were community groups, there were craft groups, there were Lions clubs, Rotarians, there was all sorts of community organisations represented in the room. And at the end of the session, or following the completion of the session, I had a particular participant come up to me, and she was from a dog obedience club. And she proceeded to, I won't say berate me, but she proceeded to complain about the fact that they are not categorised as a sporting club. And she said, Steve, all of these sporting clubs in the room tonight, they can get all these grants. And you know what? We can't get them because we're not classified as a sporting organisation. But you know what else? We've just grown from 90 to 170 members. We've got 80 grand in the bank. And we've just invested 250,000 of our own dollars in upgrading our dog obedience course. And she continued to tell me other really wonderful things that they were doing as a not-for-profit business. And I let her go for a little while. And then I said, do you know what? You are actually in a far better position than a lot of the sporting clubs in this room that have come to rely on grants. And what I mean by that is quite literally, I meet weekly with sporting clubs across the country and we talk about their facilities and we talk about their programs and activities and events. And they tell us their great ideas they've got for improving their service delivery and improving their playing field lighting or netball court surfaces. And I say, great, how are you going to make that stuff happen? How are you going to fund those initiatives? And based on the topic of today's discussion, you can probably guess what they say. They say, yeah, we'll get a grant for that. And increasingly, I'm saying, you probably won't. If you rewind to the mid-thousands, at least here in Queensland, most facility applications that sporting clubs lodged were successful. If you were eligible and your project was eligible, and you read the guidelines and you answered the questions that were actually in the application form and you provided all of the supporting documentation that you're required to provide, you got the grant because there was lots of money and there weren't that many groups applying. Fast forward to 2025 here in Queensland and certainly across the rest of the country, that is not the case any longer. We live in a very different grant environment. The landscape looks vastly different from how it did in the mid-thousands. And not only do you need to be eligible, but your project, your organisation, your grant application itself needs to stand out from the crowd to even have a look in at being successful. And if you've applied for grants, and I suspect that a lot of you are here because you have applied for grants and you've not been successful in securing all of them, I'm pretty confident, and I know from familiar names online that some of you at least have been successful in the grants that you've written. Nevertheless, you're not going to win them all. And that is truer now even than it was back in probably 2018 or thereabouts when I was running this leaseholder forum that I mentioned a moment ago. But I said to this dog obedience club president, you're actually doing a far better job than these sporting clubs in the room who are over-reliant on grants. You are running a successful business. Now, there's a big difference between not-for-profit and no-profit. And this is something that we talk about a lot, and I make no mistakes for coming back to almost every opportunity I get. The only thing that not-for-profit means is that your club can't distribute its profits amongst its members. Your club must trade profitably. That means make more money each year than it spends. Because if you don't do that, you're doing one of two other things. You're breaking even or you're losing money. And I'm no economist, and some at CPR Group will tell you that Steve Connolly ain't great with numbers. Nevertheless, I know that if you break even or lose money for enough years in a row, you're going to run out of it. and you won't be able to pay your bills as and when they fall due, and you will be insolvent, and your decision makers, board or committee members, can be held personally liable for that matter. So that's not a risk I want to run. I want to run a successful business. Not-for-profit does not mean no profit. Your club must trade profitably. You just can't give that profit to your members. They're not shareholders. So how to win more grants? Run a good business. Forget about grants. Sure, get them where you can, but don't rely on them. And you'll find often that the clubs that win more grants are the ones that need them less. The next question that we get asked quite a bit is, right, well, there's the Grant Guru website, there's Grants Hub, there's Grant Finder websites from our state government, territory government and the federal government. Which ones should we be going for? And I say grants are for projects and not operations. If you are looking for grants to prop up your operational expenditure, stop looking, because it's really rare to find. Now, operational grants like those available around COVID were the exception, not the rule. Grants that we're talking about today are for things that we buy, things that we build, or things that we do. Now, when you go looking for grants, you should actually already have your projects in mind. And I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. But grants, typically speaking, should help you deliver the projects that are already a really high priority for your club. And those grants should help you deliver those projects either bigger, better, or sooner. Your priority projects should be so important to your club, organisation, association, society, that you will strive to deliver those projects regardless of funding success. If your grant is not successful, you might need to scale down the project, you might need to push its timeframes back a little bit, delay its delivery, but you should still be working towards delivery of that project. So in answer to this question, you should be seeking grant funding towards the projects that will deliver the greatest impact on your ability to deliver your objects in your constitution or your purpose. Now, you might be a charity and you might have a charitable purpose, or you might just be another not-for-profit entity that has a constitution, and in that constitution are objects, and like I say, they set out the reasons that you exist, the reasons that your organisation was set up in the first place. And some people might start there when they're writing a mission, for instance. So how then should we determine which projects are most important to us as an organisation? So you can see that these two questions are nicely interlinked. What sort of projects should we seek grant funding towards? The ones that are going to enable you to deliver on your purpose. So how should we determine which projects are most important to us then? If you take nothing else away from this session, make it this point. Start with your project and not with a grant. If you want to write down a silly little saying to help you remember this, write this down. The projects that get the dough are the projects that are ready to go. And the buzz phrase that we hear from councils and we hear from government is shovel ready. The better planned your project is, the easier it will be to get a grant. And assessors are often looking at how much of a risk your project is. So if you've more deeply planned your project and you have identified the need for that project through a consultative process, and you are not just applying for the grant because the grant is available, then your chances of success are far greater. This ties really nicely once again into this question, and this one I get asked probably the second most out of all the questions in today's FAQ session. Will having a strategic plan help us win more grants? Having a strategic plan which has been prepared through consultation with your members and other stakeholders helps really clearly to demonstrate that you have been through a consultative process and you're not just implementing a knee-jerk reaction to some grant funding becoming available. And unfortunately for you, if this is the way that your organisation operates, where you simply look through the grant finder websites to find the grants that might align with your organisation in terms of eligibility, and then you start making up projects to match that grant program, you're probably not going to be very successful. And that is a knee-jerk reaction to funding becoming available. So I want to now ask you a quick question, and I want you to answer the little poll that's come up on your screen. Which of the following best describes your organisation? We have a current up-to-date strategic plan that we're actively following. We have an expired strategic plan that needs to be revised. We are currently pulling one together. We've never had a strategic plan before, or I got no idea. I'll give you a moment to pop your response in there, and then I'll share you all the results to show you the spread. We've got a bit of a mix coming in, which is interesting and not a big surprise. All right, we've got a handful of responses. There's still a good number that haven't yet popped their response in. I'll close that poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and I'll give you a look at the results. So there's a pretty broad spread here, and the leading two are we've got a current up-to-date strategic plan and you're actively following it. Brilliant. A third of you said that. Another third of you said we have an expired strategic plan that needs to be revised. Great that you've had one. Also brilliant that you've identified that it's time to revise that plan or prepare a new one. A small number of you said we're currently preparing a plan. Some of you have said we've never had one before, and one person said, I got no idea. Thank you for your honesty. And that may be because you're new to the organisation or you're not necessarily in a role that has been exposed to the plan. However, if you've got a strategic plan with your organisation, I suggest that every member, every stakeholder should know about it. You should be singing that from the rooftops. So there's a good spread there, and I like to conduct this little poll just to demonstrate the kind of breadth of situations that those organisations joining us in these sessions represent. So having a strategic plan is not the panacea. It is not going to be your silver bullet that makes every single grant that you write successful. However, it is going to, like I said earlier, demonstrate that your organisation has identified the need for that project meaningfully. You have, and you say that the need for this project has been identified through our strategic planning process, which involved consultation with our members, with our landlord, maybe council, with our state government, Department of Sport and Recreation, with our state sporting organisation. Here's a letter of support to confirm that, for instance, and members, families, parents, neighbours, local community representatives, other organisations that use our facility, for instance. We engaged with those stakeholders, and this project has been identified as the highest priority project by our organisation. You can rest assured that that will strengthen your case for grant funding, and it is certainly not going to hurt your cause. So ideally, following a strategic planning process with external support from the likes of us here at CPR Group is a great way to make sure that your plan is well considered, representative of the views of a range of stakeholders, and is clear and concise and maps out a vision for the next, say, 3 years of your club. But even if you don't engage external support, and I'll pop a little QR code on the screen in just a moment where you can register your interest if you do want to talk with us about strategic planning. But even if you don't go down that path, at the very least, you should, in the first instance, when you're starting to plan for grants, identify all the things that you want. Write your wish list. This is the things that you want to buy, the things that you want to build, the things that you want to do. And you'll ideally then come up with a list that might be 10 outcomes long, it might be 50 outcomes long. That's going to depend on your organisation, its structure, its size, and so on. Then you want to list your 3 highest priorities within the next 12 months. What are the critical things that you want to get done? And again, referring back to the objects in your constitution, your mission, your vision, your values as an organisation, that should help to give you some clues which of the projects are going to best align with your purpose as an organisation. So the first thing to identify from your big list of wants is the 3 highest priorities within the next 12 months. And then you might identify the 3 highest priority projects within the next 3 years. So you've got a list of 6 projects, 3 to do in 12 months and 3 to do across the next 3 years. Now, even though you've identified those projects and then prioritised them, you might find that grant funding for a project you've identified as a 3-year priority becomes available in a few months. Are you going to say, no, we won't apply for that grant now because that's a project we were going to do down the track? Probably not. You're probably going to reconsider your priorities based on grant funding becoming available, and that's okay because the project itself features prominently in your planning for your club's future, regardless of grants. So remember, this is all happening, this planning process, before you're even thinking about grants. Use this as the foundation for then going to look for grants that match your projects. When identifying and prioritizing your projects, remember to follow the path of least resistance and stick to your core business. As I've touched on, don't go inventing projects just because money is available. And I often tell the story about an off-road motorcycling club. So two-wheel motorcycles doing motocross. That's what that club's core business was. They identified a grant, a disability support grant, and what they were going to do with that grant is buy a quad bike. And they were going to fit that quad bike out with apparatus to take people with physical disabilities on joyrides through the national park next to their motocross track. It was a great project, and it may well have been funded. We were talking in the late thousands, so there was still more money around and less clubs applying for it. But it would have taken that money away from projects that I think would have been more likely to deliver meaningful outcomes for people living with physical disabilities. And this is why. I started to ask the club, when they told me about this idea, who was going to take people on joyrides on this kitted out quad bike? And they said, we'll get volunteers to do it. And I said, okay, how do you go getting enough volunteers to fill your committee positions? They said, oh, we struggle. We really struggle to get people to stick their hands up for the committee roles. People just don't want to take on that responsibility, you know? I said, okay, how do you go getting enough people to maintain your track? Oh, it's tough. We really struggle. You know, our president, he has to take off half a Friday every single week from his own business to come down the track and maintain our track and get it ready for the weekend. I said, okay. How do you go getting enough people for the canteen? Oh, it's really tough. You get my point. They were already overstretched in terms of the volunteers that were doing the core business in their club. And I said, so you're going to take your already overburdened volunteer workforce, of whom there are too few, and you're going to give them another job. I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to buy that quad bike. You're going to fit it out with the apparatus. You might take one or two people on a joyride through the national park and feel good about yourselves. But then people aren't going to volunteer to do it anymore. And that apparatus is going to keep taking skin off people's shins when they walk into your storage shed. They're going to take the apparatus off that quad bike and it's going to get a tow hitch fitted to it, and it's going to get used for track maintenance, towing things around the track. I said, yeah, you're probably right. I said, that project is not going to support you in delivering your core business, delivering on your purpose as an organisation. Notwithstanding the fact that they might have got the money, it was not a project that was going to support their why. So consider why your organisation exists to ensure that the projects that you're identifying are aligned with that purpose, and then go looking for grants that match. So and that process ideally should happen through a strategic planning program. If you want more information about strategic planning, scan that QR code, take a photo of the screen, pop that URL into your web browser, and we'll be really happy to talk with you about how we can help your organisation to pull together a meaningful strategic plan. And we have a range of options in terms of how comprehensive or otherwise that strategic planning process you want to look. And we work with organisations of all shapes and sizes to prepare meaningful strategic plans that guide them successfully towards a shared vision for the future, and they live their life as an organisation on purpose. This is the most common question that I get asked. So, will having a strategic plan help us get more grants is the second most common. This is the most common question. Will it hurt our chance of success if we've got some coin in the bank? Money in the bank demonstrates to a funding provider that your organisation is actually able to deliver the project that you're applying for, and that your organisation recognises that not-for-profit doesn't mean no profit. You need to run your organisation as the business that it is. Your organisation is there to deliver great services, activities and events. Yes, you can't distribute your profits amongst your members, but grant providers know that those organisations that have some cash reserves for a rainy day, topical for those in southeast Queensland right now, or for when things really turn to custard and we experience a global pandemic and your ability to generate revenue disappears overnight, yet your expenses in many cases carry on, funding providers know that organisations like yours need money in the bank. Money, cash in the bank is where growth lives. If you have cash in the bank, you can invest in growth. In some cases, that's going to mean investing in your high priority projects that you've identified through your strategic planning process. And I can guarantee you that in almost every single case, even if you are not required to contribute to a grant-funded project, that if you say to a funding provider, we are putting money in as well as applying for this grant from you, it brings to them a very different portrayal of your organisation. If your club says, we really need this project and it's in our strategic plan and therefore we want you to give us a grant, but we ain't going to put in any of our own money, what message does that really send the funding provider? In my opinion, it tells them that you don't care enough about that project to put in even $1. And that ain't a good message to send. So I strongly suggest that even if you are not required to co-contribute towards a grant-funded project, that you put some money in. Because then you're putting your money where your mouth is. Then you are demonstrating to that funding provider that you care so much about that project being achieved that you're putting some of your own hard-earned cash in. So will it hurt your chance of success if you've got money in the bank? In my opinion, absolutely not. Look, if you've got millions of dollars in the bank and you don't really need to apply for the grant, why waste the time? If you're running a good enough business that you've traded profitably and your consolidated revenue is so healthy that you can do that project yourself, don't go for the grant. Leave it for others. You've got it worked out. Think back to my example of the Dog Obedience Club where they can apply for some grants, but they didn't need to because they were running such a damn good business, such a successful business on their own 2 feet, or 4 legs, if you will. Grants should not be seen as your financial saviour or an excuse for doing crap financial management, because funding providers will pick up on that. If you start bleeding heart sob story articulation to a grant provider and you say, we've never had a grant, and that club down the road gets all the grants, and if we don't get this grant, we'll go broke. It doesn't present a very strong investment proposition, in my opinion. The likelihood of you getting that grant is gonna be pretty slim. How can we get better prepared for when a grant opens? Let's get really practical now for the last few minutes of our time together today. We have this notion of grant ready, becoming grant ready. Have your certificate of incorporation or registration centrally saved. It's a document that you're likely to need to refer to or attach to many applications for funding, for your tenure, and other contracts. You're going to need to demonstrate that you're a legal entity. So having that document centrally stored in some cloud-hosted service is a really great start. Other documents like your constitution, your financial statements, a copy of your lease or whatever other tenure you operate under. Your strategic plan, because you've got one. If you've got a governing body and you exist within the model of affiliation of a state and national sporting organisation, if they've got plans, put the most up-to-date version of those plans in your central repository as well. Up-to-date membership details, that might be centrally stored. That might be information that is in a national database and you've got access to your club's info, or it might be the fact that you manage that separately in your own spreadsheet or other tool. That's all the documentation that I reckon as an absolute minimum you should have centrally stored and readily accessible for when you come to apply for grant funding. The last thing you want to be doing is looking for these documents when it comes time to write your application. You've done a great job preparing your application. It's competitive and you've articulated your story really clearly, and we'll talk about a couple of tips in a moment. And it's 11:50 p.m. on due date, and you can't find a copy of your constitution that is a required attachment. And all that hard work goes out the window. So don't put yourself in that situation. The last couple of points then that I'll raise are having project-specific documents there. So it might be your quotes, your plans, designs, approvals, depending on the nature of the project, and depending on the nature of the amount of money you're applying for, you might need 1, 2, 3 or more quotes or proposals for your project. And wherever you can articulate the benefits of that project using research, documentation, data that others have prepared previously, tap into that and include that in your central repository as well. So that might be things like economic, environmental and social benefits. And when we work with councils to write multi-million-dollar grant applications for federal government funding, we need to work with them to prepare a cost-benefit analysis to support a business case. And that cost-benefit analysis takes all of the costs and benefits of the project into account to create a benefit to cost ratio, which demonstrates whether the project is going to generate more benefits than costs. So that's a very sophisticated process that is required when you're applying for many millions of dollars. Most grant applications don't require that level of detail, but still if you can provide some evidence-based research that demonstrates the benefits of the project that you're looking to provide. And I'm talking really simple here. If you're building a shelter, talk about the fact that Australia is the skin cancer capital of the world. Talk about the fact that providing shelter for participants in our activities or events is going to protect them from the harmful effects of the sun's UV rays. And attach or include some of the countless data that exists out there about us here in Australia suffering terrible melanoma rates. It doesn't need to be rocket science. So let's get serious then. What are some tips for writing better grants? Firstly, engage emotionally. As I said earlier, you've got to get your application to stand out from the crowd, but don't take the bleeding heart sob story approach like I mentioned earlier. But you care about your organisation and you are so emotionally invested in your organisation that you are here around the middle of the day, on a Thursday, a weekday, a school day, to discuss securing more grants for your organisation. So you care about that organisation immensely. Let that come through. It's okay to share your passion for your organisation in your grant applications. Like I say, don't get whingy, don't get sobby, but it's okay to engage and tell a story. And I'll give you a really simple example. Let me tell you 2 stories and see which one you're more likely to remember. I know which one it is. Story 1, the king died and the queen died. Practical, boring, you're not going to remember it. Story 2, the king died and the queen died of a broken heart. Straight away, you're emotionally invested in that situation. You care a lot more about the fact that the poor queen's died because her loving life partner, the king, passed away and she died of a broken heart. So engaging emotionally and on that level at which human decisions and behaviour is actually governed. Humans are emotional beings. We make decisions based on emotions. We justify those decisions logically down the track. We've all made purchasing decisions because of how that car made us feel, because of how that house looked on the street. And then we justify the decisions to our significant others by talking about the features and benefits of that particular car, for instance. Yes, I have fallen into that trap personally, as you can probably tell. Then you want to keep it really simple. Assume a reading age of 13 years. Now, I am not suggesting that our grant assessors across Australia have a reading capability of those at 13 years of age or about, grade 8 or 9 in high school. But what I'm suggesting is that if you write in that way, if you keep things really simple and easy to understand, people who are not familiar with your organisation or its service delivery are going to be able to wrap their head around the case that you're making. And then start with the punchy facts and figures and start just like a media release or news article, really important stuff up front, and then taper off. So building a shelter for your participants that's going to keep them out of the harmful effects of the sun's UV rays, data, data, data. Why is it so important that we're keeping people out of the sun? Use all of that really strong case making information up front and then talk about the nice to haves. It's also going to be a little cooler and more comfortable for us to participate. But that's not as important as keeping people safe from skin cancer. Then some really practical tips. Stick to the word limits. It's a little easier to do that now that most of our application portals are online. Use short sentences and plain English. This sticks with that notion of writing to a reading age of about 13 years. Dot points are great to save words where you've got word limits. Do not use jargon, acronyms, or specific terminology. Keep things really easy to understand. When you get someone, and you'll see the bottom note there, review and proofread, don't rely on spell check. If you get someone to proof your application, your draft application, get someone from outside your organisation. Don't get another committee member, don't get another volunteer from the organisation to proof it. Get someone entirely or as unfamiliar with your organisation as you possibly can, because then they are going to read it with eyes more akin to those of the grant assessors. And they'll pick up a word that you've just assumed everyone understands because you've done your activity or been a member of your club for 40 years, and that person's going to identify that, hold on, actually this doesn't make very much sense. You're going to need to clarify that for me. Make sure you answer every question fully, never leave a blank space. Even if something's not applicable for you, put NA or not applicable in that particular field. Support your answers, as I've established earlier, with research, data, documentation, evidence, wherever you possibly can. Now this one is often overlooked, replicating wording from the guidelines and the application form. If you commence, firstly, you want to review in detail the guidelines, and notwithstanding my tongue-in-cheek comment earlier on in this discussion where I said, how to win more grants, forget about grants, but a lot of people say read the guidelines and understand them deeply. Absolutely, 100%. It is a critical step in the process. And when you're doing that review of the guidelines, highlight words in the guidelines that relate to the desirable outcomes for the grant program. What is it that that funding provider is hoping to achieve by giving out grants through this program? And it might be to increase physical activity opportunities for people living across Queensland. It might be to enhance the lives of people living with a disability. Highlight those words, and wherever you can, use those words in your answers. But as well as that, take wording from the questions and use them in your answers. For instance, how will this project benefit your organisation and the community if successful? The best way I can suggest starting your answer is like this. If successful, this project will benefit our organisation and the community by ... If you start by answering the actual question that they have asked, you can't go wrong. The number of times that I review draft grant applications written by others, now we don't typically write grant applications for organisations like many of yours any longer. What we do is we build capacity and we mentor and train people to write their own, because then we're teaching them to fish for a lifetime. They can write those grant applications themselves without needing to spend money to have them prepared time after time. But I can't tell you the number of draft grant applications that I've read where I've read an answer and I've looked again at the question that they're trying to answer and it doesn't do the job. They've got a narrative, they've got a story that they want to tell, which is great, engaging emotionally, but they're not answering the question. If you're not answering the question, you're not going to get top marks for that particular answer. If you start your answer with the wording from the question, you won't go wrong. Unless it's prohibited, include appendices and clearly link to those attachments in your answers. Now, this could have been a question on its own. I've included it here to not give it too much attention. But if you're not using AI, a language model like ChatGPT or Google's Gemini, for instance, to help with the creation of your grant applications, you're misusing your time. You absolutely should be using support from AI to help frame your story, to help build your narrative, and to help answer the questions. What are some of the reasons that this project might be beneficial, for instance? Use those prompts from an AI language model to support you in creating your answer, and have it shorten your responses or build you an answer that meets the character limits of that particular question in the application form. But do not, and I repeat, do not simply copy and paste content from one of these AI language models into your answer form and click submit. because assessors will be able to tell that that's happened. There are little cues, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, but there are really clear cues for people like us who use a lot of AI, and we can tell when others have done so and they haven't ensured appropriate human oversight. It is really, really obvious. So do not do that, because you are not demonstrating or putting your best foot forward in terms of your organisation and its genuine need for that project. You are not clearly articulating the reality that you've identified the project's need through a consultative strategic planning project. You are copying and pasting and using text from a computer system, a program that will hallucinate, and it will get things wrong, and it will use words that don't fit in that particular sentence. And if you simply copy and paste, it's not going to augur very well, in my opinion, for your success. And start writing early. Do not leave it until the end of the application window. If you've done your project planning and you've identified the projects that are best going to support you in your delivery of your objects and purpose as an organisation, and then you've gone looking for grants, and by the time the grant actually opens, you know exactly what you're applying for, and you're not trying to build the plane as you fly it, which for many people online today, I'm pretty confident that some of you have tried to write a grant application for a project that wasn't really clearly defined and you had to try and make it up as you went. That's really hard. If you're applying for a grant and the project is one that you've already identified the need for and why really clearly, the grant almost writes itself. Start writing early. Do not leave it until the last minute. It is a heartache you do not need. Here are our next few workshops in our free series for CPR groups online workshops this year. Strengthening your club's constitution in September. Powerful meetings, powerful results in October, and navigating club legal requirements. We're looking to take a similar sort of FAQ approach. If you've got questions that you want to get into the mix for any of those sessions, please send them through. We also call on our podcast listeners, basket case clubs, to send us questions. And similarly, please always send those questions in. We love hearing from our listeners and those who join these webinar sessions so that we can address those questions. I can see there's some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to jump over there very shortly. Before I do that, here is our Basket Case Clubs podcast logo. If you enter Basket Case Clubs into Spotify, Google Play, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, you'll find us on there. And we talk about all things clubs, challenging situations that clubs have faced, some stories of basket case clubs, but importantly, some examples of clubs that have turned things around to become showcase clubs. You can get in touch with us via our website, cprgroup.com.au, and if you have enjoyed today's session, as always, please feel free to scan that QR code on your screen and head over to Google and give us a 5-star review. We always love hearing from our listeners and those who join our online sessions. So I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A in here now and look to address some of these. Thanks very much to those who've entered these questions. It's great to see people engaging in this way. Okay, my club has a lease for a hall. We sublet to 2 other tenants to keep the finance going, but the 2 aircon units got old and became faulty and could cause a fire hazard. So every hall user is not using it, and it gets very cold at night. The quote for 1 aircon is 15 grand, and we have 2 old ones. This is way out of our funding pool. We cannot manage on our own to do it. Yep. Okay, thank you very much, Isaac, for sharing there. And look, absolutely, there are some instances where your organisation is going to need to tap into grant funding. However, I'm going to pose a challenge to you. And this can be confronting for some of the organisations online today. Often, things like air conditioning units feature in a lease or other tenure document as something that the organisation, that your organisation is responsible for replacing. So perhaps, and again, take this in the spirit in which it's intended, and this is not going to apply across the board, but for some of your organisations, there's a chance that, let's say you're charging, in your case, Isaac, for use of the hall, and you have set that fee based on a certain operating environment and your knowledge that you're going to need to cover certain expenses. If you've not taken into account the need to replace your air conditioning unit eventually, maybe you're not charging enough. Maybe you need to consider a revision of your fee structure to accommodate the reality that eventually you're going to have big expensive things that need to be replaced. And air conditioning units, in many cases, are included in that list. So, and again, Isaac's offered some further context here that the organisation offers music performances to the general public free of charge. The hall is used solely for rehearsal and other sublet tenants. So I'm glad that I've qualified my earlier comment, because indeed for your organisation, Isaac, it's likely to be the case that you're going to need some grant funding support. And again, this is why for many community organisations, for many small charitable organisations, for instance, grants exist. They exist to prop up your activities, your services, your events, because you don't have a revenue generating model that is self-sustaining. So for some organisations, grants become quite critical to doing big expensive projects. And it's therefore important that you put your best foot forward and give yourselves the best chance of success when it comes to seeking grant funding. Okay, so the question then is, how much should I co-contribute to a $30,000+ bill? Well, and then there's installation fees just to remove the fire hazard, or just keep the hall without temperature control. 50% question mark. We have $14,000 left in the hall cleaning fee cost of $5,400 a year. So I suggest that anything, Isaac, that you can put in is great. I absolutely wouldn't advocate for 50% and clearing out your cash reserves, because as I said earlier, funding providers recognise the importance of having cash in the bank, having some trading cash so that you can actually do business. But if you can tip in a modest amount, so significantly less than the amount that you've currently got in the bank, but demonstrate to them that to the funding provider, that is, that to your organisation that represents a substantial contribution given your operating environment, then that counts for a lot. Even if it was $1,000, it demonstrates to them that you recognise the importance of that project and you are putting your money where your mouth is. And you will by doing so, you will set yourself apart from many other organisations that are applying for that same grant and they're putting in diddly squat. So consider what is reasonable and financially responsible for your organisation to contribute. As I said earlier, it's critical in terms of a legal obligation to prevent insolvent trading that your management committee doesn't make a decision to put so much money in that the solvency of your organisation would be jeopardised. But putting in at least a little bit of money, like I say, in the context of your operating financial position, really stands to make a strong case to the funding provider. So thank you, Isaac, for those questions. I really appreciate the fact that you've shared so openly and have put that into the mix for consideration. So I hope you loved that session. Certainly those who joined real time and participated in the session, we had some great feedback at the end in the chat and in the feedback. So as always, a pleasure to join you today via Basket Case Clubs, even though the format's a little different. And we'll be taking this approach, and next session, next one of those online workshops, we're going to be recording as well, and hopefully doing it a little bit conversationally, so a little bit more like our podcast episodes here at Basket Case Clubs. And it'll be a couple of us from the CPR group team talking through how to strengthen your club's constitution. So again, we always get some fascinating questions, and we'll be tackling that topic in an FAQ format once again. So as always, thank you to Jess, our producer, for the awesome job you do making us sound incredible, touching up our audio and cutting crappy bits out and putting better bits in. And if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, head over to our website, cprgroup.com.au, jump on and tap into our wealth of knowledge. Of course, I'm a little biased, and I'm going to say that we send out always very relevant information. But again, we get really good feedback from those people on our mailing list, letting us know that it's very unspammy. So if you want to tap into that knowledge and information, regular updates on where we are around the country and the sorts of exciting things we're doing, and also the great ideas that we're seeing implemented by clubs around the place. So jump onto our website and register for our newsletters. And of course, if you're not following us on all of the social platforms on which we're active, there are too many to name. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and the like, and get in touch. Let us know what questions you've got. They might be questions that you want us to tackle in our next online workshop, Strengthening Your Club's Constitution, which is scheduled for the 18th of September. If you want to join that session live, feel free to jump onto our website as well and register for that webinar, cprgroup.com.au/webinars. And we look forward to having you along for the ride next time we connect on Basket Case Clubs. See you later.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record, being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.